Hello and welcome to this revision session for the SIPS Level 4 Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is the 2023 syllabus and we're looking at Learning Outcome 4, which is to understand and analyse the need for compliance with requirements when undertaking procurement in different sectors. So as a recap, here are the learning outcomes, and as I said, we're looking at number 4 today. So Learning Outcome 4 has 4 subsets of learning outcomes. 4.1 is to classify different economic and industrial sectors. 4.2 is to analyse the impact of the public sector on procurement and supply chain activities, whereas 4.3 looks at the private sector and 4.4 at the not-for-profits or the third sector. So in terms of 4.1, that's further broken down to 4.1.1, which is the economic classifications, which include the public, private and charities, not-for-profits or third sector, whereas 4.1.2 looks at the industrial classifications and sectors like manufacturing, retail, construction, financial, agricultural and services. So organisations within the economic or industrial sectors can be broken down into 3 categories. You've got your public, your private, your third. And these organisations have got completely different purposes. Public sector are owned by the government. They provide us with goods and services for the benefit of the community, and they're run by the government and they operate with the money that's raised from taxes. Private sector are organised and owned by individuals or corporations, and these businesses are driven by profit as their motive. And the profit from the private sector organisation will benefit the owners, the shareholders and the investors. And they're financed by private money from shareholders and bank loans. The third sector organisations are owned and run by voluntary organisations or by trustees. So these organisations are not run with the need to make a profit, but they do need to cover their costs and they might need help from the local community. So they operate with money that's sometimes donated to them, gifted to them, and sometimes they generate income through selling in, like charity shops on the high street. But any surplus they have above and beyond their cost is just reinvested into the organisation. And sometimes they run as a social enterprise as well. So if we look at the public sector, these organisations, as I said, are owned and run by the government to provide us with essential services. And they're funded primarily through taxation. The primary objective is to deliver what we class as essential services, and the accessibility to those services is quite an important performance measure for governments. So examples will be like education, so you've got your schools, your colleges, emergency services, be it police, ambulance, the fire service. You've got healthcare, which are doctors and hospitals. You've got military, which is things like the Army, the Navy, the Royal Air Force. You've got social services, you've got transport, and you've got waste. Public sector is either centrally led or locally led. And then there's some other smaller ones that sit around the surface of that too, but the central government set minimum standards across services offered to the public. And central government is run by what we call ministers, which is where they're elected into power. So when you go and vote in the national elections, you're voting for whoever's going to lead your country, if you're in that sort of democratic environment. The same applies with local government, because there are local elections, again, in certain countries across the world, and again, run by ministers, and they interact with the general public in order to set specific targets to meet the specific needs for that local area. And they do receive some funding from central government, but they also administer local taxes like council tax and things like that. So the latter 3 are not run by ministers, so they're purely run by civil servants. So the non-ministerial departments just have the civil servants, and they cover things like, I don't know, sort of regulators, that sort of thing. So you've got Ofsted and Ofwat and pensions regulator, those sorts of organisations. So there are some public enterprises that deliver public programmes, goods and services. And in the UK, we have one which is known as the BBC, the British Broadcasting Consortium, funded through television licence. And I've put quangos on here too. So the quango stands for quasi-autonomous non-government organisation. And these are organisations that essentially are run by private sector organisations, but they're a public service. So in some countries, that's things like prisons. So obviously prisons, you're staying at the what is it? They say Her Majesty's Service or His Majesty's Service now with the King of England. But a lot of the way in which they're run are outsourced to sort of large outsourced companies like Serco and G4S, those sorts of companies. And some border controls are the same. So they're quangos. One of the things that's quite different about public sector organisations is that they do something called commissioning, which are activities that generate demand for their services. As you can probably appreciate, public sector don't actually sell anything, so they get taxed from taxation in order to deliver essential services. But in order to know what those services need to be, they will go through a commissioning cycle. And in the UK, every 10 years we do a census. I'm not sure if that applies to all countries, but the census will collect information from the general public in terms of things like age, number of people living in the house, whether those people have got any health conditions, long-term, short-term, what sort of income goes into a house, whether they're got any sort of higher education, all that sort of stuff. And what that helps the government to do is to analyse the local geography or the demographic that they're catering for. So, some areas are very affluent, some areas are not affluent, some areas are predominantly older people, whereas others are younger people, and so on and so forth. So in the analyse section, they basically look at the population. And they also look at what legislation tells them they have to deliver as a minimum standard. So things like waste collection would be a minimum standard. And then they look at gap analysis. So if there's any sort of specialist health conditions or anything like that in a particular area, then they'll look at the gap between what the legislation says they have to do and what they should do to help people in that local area. They then commission their strategies, design services, and then find suppliers to do it. And those suppliers could come from the private sector, the public sector, or even charities and things like that. So this commissioning cycle is, it's done every so often. I'm not quite sure if it's every 3 or 4 years, but I know that the census is done every 10 years at least. So it would be done at every 10 years as a minimum. But it's essentially sort of saying, what are the needs of the individuals? What services are going to best meet the needs of those individuals? How can we provide them? And are they meeting the defined service needs? So they always go back and review that strategy just to make sure it's actually working. Moving on to the private sector then. So the way in which you approach procurement is going to very much depend on the context in which it operates. So different approaches are needed according to that sector. And in the private sector, the primary objective, as we know, is to make a profit. But in terms of how they're funded, I think initially it probably would have started with a bit of investment from the founders of that company, the people that started it in the first place. They may have gone to the bank and borrowed some money so they can be funded through what we call debt, so bank loans. But the main part of their everyday funding will come from what we call revenue or sales. So for everything they sell, they get money coming in from the customer. But even then, they're broken into two types of companies. You've got unincorporated companies, which don't have a registered company name or number, and those that do. So they're the incorporated ones that do have a registered name and number. So unincorporated businesses are generally sole traders, which are people that work on their own. It could be a window cleaner, a hairdresser, a taxi driver. Others are in partnerships. So the partners may work together to complement one another, or they both do the same thing. But it's essentially two sole traders coming together, two or more sole traders coming together to form a partnership, and they have to kind of share the profits. Incorporated companies, as I say, are registered, so they have a name. So it's no longer a person or a couple of people you're working with. You're working with a registered company. And you have to be registered, certainly in the UK, at a company's house, but there might be different versions of incorporation in different countries. And you would consider this to be a separate legal entity from its owners, in the sense that you could sell the company on to another owner, which obviously you can't do if you're a sole trader or a partner, because the business is you. That means that the owners are not legally responsible for all the debts. So when you see the word limited in the title, so you've either got public limited companies, PLCs, or private limited companies, which are LTDs, it's the limited means that the owners have limited liability. So if the company was to struggle financially, the government have the powers to shut the company down. So that's the big difference. So yeah, they're limited liability, but unincorporated companies are not. So, for example, if a sole trader has a supplier invoice that needs paying and they don't pay it, they're personally responsible for that, whereas wouldn't be the case in incorporated. In terms of the private limited companies, there's a maximum of 50 shareholders, firstly, but the shareholders have to be known to the business. So they're likely to be the owners, long-standing members of staff like directors, or possibly family friends. Whereas the public limited ones, the PLCs, can have unlimited shareholders because they're selling shares on the stock exchange. It's an example known as sort of floating. They float on the stock exchange. So moving on to the third sector. Third sector or not-for-profit can be used interchangeably. Primary objective is to create social wealth, and they're mainly funded through donations, voluntary contributions, but they can receive grant funding and they can generate their own money through sort of selling goods or services too. The prime thing is, though, that even when they do sell, they don't sell with the intention to make a profit. It's purely just to cover costs. So some of these examples are social enterprises. They might be, I don't know, counselling services for children, mutuals, private companies owned by its employees, or potentially a cooperative, which is similar to a mutual, except it's not just owned by its employees. It's a sort of membership approach. You've got housing associations. They're there to sort of bridge the gap between private housing and social housing. So it's affordable for those on low incomes. You've got voluntary groups who are delivered by volunteers. So it could be things like Neighbourhood Watch. You've got community organisations like food banks, self-help groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and some charities as well. So the big charities on the high street is things like, Cancer Research, Oxfam, Save the Children. So third sector organisations do function differently from the public and the private sector in aspects such as their goals. So they may be awareness raising, fundraising and service delivery. In terms of their stakeholders, there's a much wider range of stakeholders in the private sector, including their donors, the media and the recipients of their services. Speed of delivery can often take a little bit longer than the public or private sector because of how many people are involved. Their resources are very limited, not in terms of just the fact that not everyone's going to do something for free or for very little money. They're often run by volunteers, but even those that are skilled, they don't attract huge salaries because the bigger salaries are being paid in the private sector. And then budgets, they're very limited and they don't necessarily have regular income like other organisations do. So this is just showing you a summary of the differences between the public, the private and the third sector. These are the things I've already mentioned. So just take a moment to look at this before I move on to the next page. There are three types of industry sectors you need to recognise in your exams: the primary, secondary and the tertiary. I've actually added the quaternary sector on too, which is a sector that's been added in recent years, but it was always just the three: primary, secondary and tertiary. So this focuses on what a company does rather than who owns them. So if you are primary sector, you are involved in the extraction of raw materials, farming, fishing, Essentially, you're looking at the raw material end of the market. In the secondary sector, you transform. So you're either manufacturing stuff, so you're taking raw materials, converting it into products. Utility companies that are sort of refining oils and gases and things like that, or construction where you're taking sort of bricks and steel and timber and making a property, let's say, out of the raw materials that you've purchased. The tertiary sector provides services only, so they don't grow anything, they don't make anything, but they're actually quite a large sector. So it covers things like retail, finance, telecommunications, hospitality, leisure, real estate, and IT, whereas the quaternary sector is kind of concerned with intellectual advancements. So it looks at things like the education. Sometimes public sector staff can sit there if they're sort of looking at innovation, as well as research and development. So 4.2, this is all about the public sector again. We'll look at the objectives. So they support things like communities, social value, equality, diversity, and inclusion. Any regulations that impact on them, and the role of competition, public accountability, value for money in public sector and procurement and supply. So let's look at the objectives of public sector. Services first and foremost need to be fit for purpose. They need to be accessible to those who need them. So longer opening hours, better standards of care are sorts of things that they're looking at, but budgets are constrained. So this is always going to be a challenge for them. So to obtain cost savings and work on cost avoidance is probably going to be a good strategy for public sector. Some of the things that potentially need those longer opening hours or better standards are things like public toilets, libraries, care homes, recycling plants. Supporting communities and social value could be another objective in terms of, investing in social housing, creating a safe place for people and children to play, or creating centres perhaps for the elderly to meet. And social benefit will include supporting the growth of the local businesses by utilising, say, local suppliers where possible, employing local people, or offering apprenticeship opportunities. So from a corporate social responsibility perspective, there should be quite a few opportunities in the public sector. Like I say, sourcing from sustainable suppliers, maybe initiating projects that give back to the local community, look at regenerating wasteland and cleaning up the polluted areas, undertaking business in an ethical way, and promoting the interests of employment of disadvantaged members of society. Which leads me really nicely onto equality, diversity, and inclusion, because under the Equalities Act, there are 9 protected characteristics, which are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. So for them, it's so important that they have a diverse workforce, a diverse supply chain, because they need to be serving a very diverse community. In terms of regulations, there are a few themes here in terms of the fact that they can't discriminate. So non-discrimination is a good theme here in the sense that, when they advertise their tender opportunities, they can't deliberately restrict a supplier from bidding because, let's say we don't want a supplier that's based in Germany to bid, for example. That would be a sort of direct discrimination. And indirect discrimination could be putting in your tender something that maybe accidentally, and might not necessarily be deliberate, but accidentally would preclude others from being able to bid. A lot of public sector organisations sign up to some kind of treaty, so that will allow for sort of the free movement of goods and services within a sort of geographical region. You've then got equality of treatment amongst the suppliers, so you don't just pick your favourite, you make sure you go through a robust evaluation process. And then you've got the transparency requirements to advertise your opportunities, but also the outcomes of any tenders and contracts. So everybody kind of knows what's happening and it's not not being done sort of behind the scenes. The next thing to talk about is the fact that there is an obligation for them to tender when the value of a contract exceeds a threshold, and the thresholds do change every 2 years or so, but it's roughly about £200,000 for goods and services. It's about 500,000-ish for social care and health related services, and then around 5 million for construction. So as soon as you go over those thresholds, there's an expectation for you to either buy from a public framework that's already been through a competitive process, or to advertise. And the sorts of processes and procedures that you can use at the moment, because this is going to change with the Procurement Act coming into force in October 2024. But at the moment, the procedures are an open procedure, which is advertised to any bidder, and it's a default approach. It's the most open and transparent. But in certain circumstances, it's necessary to do a two-stage restricted tender. So stage one is a pre-qualification section. And that's so that, I guess, if there are specific reasons why you might need to ensure that suppliers have certain, I don't know, accreditations or they're financially viable, you would do that at stage one before you take them through to stage two. The third one is known as competitive dialogue, and you'd consider this for complex outcome-based requirements where you need to engage with the supplier who's going to help you to refine or define that solution. Or a competitive procedure with negotiation where it's difficult to buy something as an off-the-shelf solution. So you engage with the suppliers to define the spec, which again, they eventually bid on. Price is always the last thing in dialogue and negotiation, because you're not dialoguing about price or negotiating about price in the last two procedures. It's more about the solution or the specification. And then once you've nailed that down, the prices are called for at the end. This is how frameworks work. So as I said, if you're above the threshold, you either do one of the previous tender processes or you buy from a framework. Frameworks are constructed in a number of different ways. You've got the kind of one-to-one, so one buyer, one supplier. You've got one buyer with many suppliers. Or if you are buying from a sort of public buying organisation, so there are lots of framework companies out there where many purchasers can buy from the framework, either with one supplier or many. If you've only got one supplier, you're only going to be doing a direct award probably. But where you've got many suppliers, you can still direct award. Some would have a requirement for you to go with the first ranked supplier first, or potentially you go to them and ask for them to compete for your piece of work. So you give them the specification, everything else, and let's say there are 5 suppliers on the framework, all 5 get invited to the opportunity, and the best supplier wins. Other things that kind of impact on public procurement is that every now and again, the government will issue something called a PPN, which stands for a Procurement Policy Note, and they're regulations prepared and administered by the Crown Commercial Services, and they're aimed to help public sectors procure goods and services in a fair and transparent manner in line with our public sector requirements. So it's essentially like amendments sometimes. And they do provide guidance on a wide range of subjects like the data use, visibility, threshold levels, when they change every few years. But here's just a few of the ones that were issued in 2023. And actually, there's quite a lot of regulations in the public sector. The ones I talk about most is the top one, which is public contract regs. That kind of applies to the wider public sector. But if you're a utility, energy, or transport company, you're going to follow something called UCR, which is utilities contract regs. If you are advertising a contract which would allow a private entity to generate revenue from it, that would go under the concession contract regulations. And then you've got your public procurement regulations, which are amendments that were made to public contract regs and the concession regulations, and a whole load of other things that apply in Equalities Act, transparency codes, etc., etc. So the numerous regulations on procurement can have both positive and negative inputs. Positively, some of the advantages we come across is that you get uniform processes. It will enhance enhance control and reduce the risk, providing with accountability and traceability, especially given that you open up the contracts to a wider market. The disadvantages is that it can suppress innovation sometimes, because certainly when you're doing open and restricted tenders, you have to give a very specific specification for suppliers to bid on. That will then potentially reduce your competition, time consuming and costly, and you've got a very strict evaluation process, which may remove the best supplier. One regulation doesn't always suit all genres, and it can become a bit inflexible. The National Audit Office used criteria to assess the value for money of government spending. So it's the optimal use of resources to achieve the intended outcomes. And they use a process known as the 3 E's, which has been extended to 4, but we'll talk about the first 3 E's first, which is economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. Economy is minimizing costs of resources used or required. So it's essentially about spending less. Efficiency is the relationship between the output from goods and services and the resources to produce them. So that's all about spending well. And effectiveness is the relationship between the intended and actual result of public spending. So what was the outcome, and did they spend that money wisely? So as I said, the fourth E got added. It's not in the diagram on the screen, but I want to tell you about it anyway. The fourth E that's being used at the moment is equity. And that is the extent to which services are available to and reach all people they're intended to. So that's about spending fairly. So some people may receive differing levels of services for reasons other than differences in the level of their need. So for example, the cost and level of provision of a service is more for one group of people than potentially for another group of people with similar needs. And some people can't reach, see, hear, or use that service. The service may be unusable for some people's specific needs, and a service is provided in a language sometimes that some people don't speak or in terms they don't understand. And some people are unaware that the services are actually available to them in any case. So that's kind of the value for money part to it. And the other bits that I've listed on the left-hand side is competition, which of course we've spoken about in terms of that, those procurement procedures, but there's also an accountability element to what we do. We're public servants, so we have to be transparent in our dealings. We have to be efficient and responsible for the actions that we take, and we have to do that with integrity and trustworthiness. So looking at the private sector next, we're going to look at the objectives of them, such as market share, shareholder value, environmental, social, governance and economic viability, any regulations that impact them, and the importance of the role of branding in procurement and supply. So businesses have different objectives that are linked directly to the ambitions of that business. And these objectives are influenced by the size of the business and its ownership. But profit maximization is a variation of the profit objective. And this is when an organization aims to make as much profit as possible. And they do this by finding the right balance between their selling price, the sales volume, and the cost of production. Market share relates to the sales made in a particular market. So to increase market share, a business will aim to increase their sales or aim to become the number one business in that industry. Social responsibility is concerned with the business's activities not causing damage to the environment or people. So, for example, businesses sometimes use biodegradable packaging to reduce the harm it does to the wildlife or the atmosphere. So in terms of private sector income and expenditure, so they're going to get money coming into their business from selling products or services. They might receive money from the government. They could actually get interest from money in the bank or investments from, income generating investments. So I don't know, maybe they buy properties or something like that and then get income from the leasing of those properties. They also have to spend money though, because it's a bit of a speculate to accumulate type example. So expenditure covers things like utilities and salaries, rents, any loan repayments, capital asset purchases, and any direct purchases, which are materials and things like that, and labour. So in terms of like profitability, the aim of profitability is to generate a return for the shareholders who have invested in that business in the first place. And they get their return on investment through potentially dividends. So at the end of each year, there's a share of profits that are distributed evenly amongst shareholders. So if there is someone with 2 shares and someone else with 1 share, the person with 2 shares would get twice as much dividends as the one who only has 1. You've got growth in capital and equity value of shareholders, and you get that through retaining some of the profits because, on one hand, you think, let's maximize the dividends, give it back to the shareholders. But if you retain some of it in the business, you can grow the business, which means that you're just, reinvesting it to actually generate more money next year. And you can maintain or enhance the value of the company's shares or the company's assets. But again, private sector are very big on corporate social responsibility in the same way the public sector are. I mean, public sector have got a duty to do it, whereas in the private sector, they do it for the reason that it's going to help them with their reputation. And it would be silly not to, because if you were a sort of customer who valued this sort of thing, and there was a choice between buying from a company that did and one that didn't, then more likely to buy from the one that is doing this well. So the CSR responsibility is just an approach that a private organisation will take to help them to be more socially accountable. And that's accountable to itself, but also to its shareholders and the general public. But at the heart of this is sustainability. So by practicing good CSR, companies can be conscious and kind of the impact they're having on the world around them. So to engage in CSR means that in the normal course of business, a company is operating in a way that enhances society and the environment instead of contributing negatively towards them. So the attitudes towards CSR vary from one company to another. But nowadays, this is referred to as ESG. So CSR was kind of like the first version, and now we're looking at ESG, which stands for Environment, Social and Governance. Now, some companies pay what we call lip service to this approach, and that just is to say, yeah, I agree with it, it's the right thing to do, but actually they don't do anything to support it themselves. Some might even conclude that it's really not worth spending a lot of money or effort unless it's going to increase their profits or it doesn't harm their profits in any way. So some of these companies are failing to recognise the benefits because they're so busy just sort of nodding and saying, yeah, it's the right thing to do, when actually what they should be doing instead is trying to communicate and understand their stakeholders so they can move on with those relationships. And this can only be achieved by listening to the logical argument and learning from the marketplace. And where this fails, some governments have focused on, some governments actually forced CSR onto companies by introducing laws and behaviours that sort of relate to the kind of moral behaviour in businesses. So ESG stands for Environment, Social and Governance. And as you can see on the screen, the environment things look at climate change, energy, fuels, emissions, biodiversity, deforestation and water use. Society will look at some of the things we've talked about already, such as diversity, equality, employee relations, working with the local communities, but it also covers things like health and safety, training and education for people. And that's all very well and good, but if you haven't got the governance that's going to back it up and enforce it, it won't happen. So the governance looks at having board diversity, making sure that you conduct your business ethically, you have a good tax strategy, and you absolutely stamp out bribery within your business, lobbying, and also managing the risks associated with the ESG agenda. Now, states or countries legally require the private sector to operate in a way that complies with local laws of that country. And in some cases, it could involve multinational corporations that can pick and choose their suppliers and locations based on their perception of the regulation in that local environment. And sometimes that results in uneven practices just within one company. So, for example, workers in one country may benefit from strong labour unions, while workers in another country have very weak laws supporting labour unions, even though they work for the same company. So this has led to the adaptation of standards, and those developed by the International Labour Organization. So we refer to them as the ILO. So they set standards and social protection for employees on a global level. You've also got ISO, which is the International Organization for Standards that achieve things like good quality, good environmental practice. You've got the Consumer Rights Act, the General Data Protection Regulations, health and safety regulations, and even the transport driving regulations. So have a quick look at what they all mean in terms of the information attached to them. And I'll move on to the next slide. So the private sector are more flexible and open to innovation. They're profit and people driven, whereas public sector are highly regulated and sometimes a little bit inflexible. But procurement in the public sector is mechanically driven to meet regulations and often inferred, with some sort of politics associated with it. But things have changed significantly over the last few years, and here are just some of the areas of the public sector, such as bespoke trading entities, partly outsourced businesses that have proper flexibility in paying salaries that are not associated with the standard government pay scales. So less to more flexibility, pre-written versus bespoke for private sector, managed according to a process supplies in the public sector, but managed as required in the private sector, limited negotiation, freedom to negotiate. Details of the proposed work have to be published versus all suppliers can be considered. Information is open, whereas it's fairly not open in the private sector. Relationships are harder to manage in the public sector because you have to, competitively tender after a few number of years. And confidentiality is going to be an issue to maintain in the private sector. Procurement workers' salaries are predetermined in the public sector. As I say, they have, pay scales that you can't go outside of. Relationships are personal, less regulated in the private sector. Innovation is promoted, and salaries can be negotiated more in the private sector. And then you've got the brand element to it. So brands are interesting, powerful connotations of a marketplace that create value for an organization or its individuals. And it consists of all the features that distinguish the goods and services from one seller to another. So if you think about things like the name, the term, the design, the style, the symbols, the customer touch points, because together all of these elements of the brand work as a psychological trigger or a stimulus that causes an association to all other thoughts other than what they have about this brand. So a brand should inform a consumer with three things: what the product is, what the product can do, and why the product is your desired choice. So have a look at all these elements: the logo, the brand, the design, the identity. Think about something like a Coca-Cola bottle. That bottle shape can only be used by Coca-Cola. The Nike tick on the side of a trainer, McDonald's golden arches, all of these things, they are very interesting, powerful connotations that connect you with a particular brand. So look at things that can be branded. So you've got goods, you've got services, you've got retail outlets, even people, Bill Gates, Donald Trump, the Queen of England. Destinations are brands, companies, Amazon, Facebook, even concepts. So 4.4 looks at the impact of the not-for-profits. So the objectives and principles, the regulations, the impact on them, and the need for procurement within those businesses to align to their mission and objectives. So the objectives of the third sector is firstly to raise awareness, provide support and representation, as well as attracting donations and engaging their stakeholders. So as a whole, voluntary organisations engage with a huge range of issues, from youth clubs to specialist medical research. And most focus on particular issues that need solving, like affordable housing or a specific group in society who requires support or representation, maybe women facing domestic abuse. Other organisations, particularly think tanks and research initiatives, may work on a range of issues but apply a particular philosophy or a political filter. So these voluntary organisations achieve their aims through a wide range of activities like providing services or other forms of direct support and advice for groups. So it could be examples of running a women's health shelter or providing legal advice. But some also aim to achieve long-term or systematic change, and they may work with local, national, or global governments to sort of support their agenda. So in terms of like the objectives and principles is that, they register charities, they detect and remedy any serious mismanagement or deliberate abuse of, fundraising and things like that. Work with charities and other regulators to enhance public confidence in charities and the work that they do. They check the charities are run for public benefit and not private advantage, and to ensure that charities meet the legal requirements for being a charity and are equipped to operate properly and within the law, and to ensure charities are independent and their trustees take the decision that are free from control, undue influence from others. So this is essentially the Charities Commission within the UK, and you may have very similar examples of the Charities Commission in other countries. A charity has two aspects. You've got legal requirements, in terms of both the purpose of it being for public benefit. It must satisfy both the benefit and public aspects. However, if the purpose is to relieve or prevent poverty, different rules may apply. So each of the charity purposes must be for public benefit, but many charities have more than one purpose. And there are regulations that impact on third sectors like the Equalities Act 2010, the Charities Act 2012, and the Social Value Act of 2012. Although not regulations, your SIP's study guide might suggest a number of areas that can be managed, like value for money, conducting ethical procurement, promoting sustainability, benchmarking to ensure that you've got a fair price, and managing supply chain management. But one thing they've got to do is to make sure they do this and not go against what they stand for. So it is very difficult. They've got very limited sums of money to be playing with, but they can never be seen as hypocritical. So as an example, there's a very famous case study about Oxfam, who stand for quite a few things, but the biggest strapline they've got is to make poverty history and women's rights, children's rights, fair trade for farmers, that sort of thing. And they bought a load of wristbands from a supplier in the Far East, sold them for £1 or something, and everyone was buying them so that they could support the charity. They hadn't vetted their suppliers, and unfortunately, this particular wristband was being made by a factory that was employing child labour. So it just went against everything they stood for, and that led them to have quite a lot of reputational damage. So they do have to think about doing the right thing. So alignment is really important. So, if you think about the 5 columns that we've got on this screen, if you're looking just, purely financial, then it's to deliver competitive financial returns. If you're looking to be responsible, then you'll mitigate some of those ESG risks that we mentioned. Sustainable companies will pursue ESG opportunities rather than just manage or mitigate the risks. Whereas when you look at impact and impact only, the difference between the impact, well, firstly, you add on the focusing on measurable high impact solutions. But when you're impact only, instead of delivering competitive financial results, you're delivering below market financial returns. So you're not really concerned with competitive financials. It's purely just focusing on the high impact solutions. So that's the end of my learning outcome 4 revision tips for Level 4 Module 1 2023 syllabus. Thank you very much for watching. I am going to try and work on the other modules, but it will take me a little bit of time to redo all the slides. But yeah, thanks for watching and have a good day.